Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today we're looking at some pretty intriguing ideas about biblical prophecy.
Oh, wow.
Specifically, a claim that September 23rd, 2015
Okay.
was a hugely significant date, biblically speaking. That is, we'll be checking out this online video by Mike with On Point Preparedness,
All right.
who seems to have a real knack for connecting current events to biblical prophecy.
Yeah, that's certainly a unique approach. I'm really curious to see how he builds his case.
Yeah.
Especially since biblical prophecy is often open to, a lot of different interpretations.
Exactly, and he really goes deep into these interpretations, and he tries to link them to, specific events in recent history.
Mm-hmm.
His central claim is that September 23, 2015 marked like a pivotal point in the biblical timeline.
Interesting.
Potentially even the beginning of what's called the abomination of desolation, mentioned in the book of Daniel.
Right.
I don't know, have you ever come across this term before?
I have, yeah. And it's one of those concepts that has fascinated and puzzled theologians for centuries.
Yeah. It's often understood to refer to like an event or a series of events that defile the sanctity of like a holy place or time.
Mm-hmm.
And in the context of biblical prophecy, it's often associated with the end times.
Yeah.
So Mike thinks this abomination of desolation may have already happened back in 2015.
He does, and to arrive at that conclusion, he uses this really fascinating calculation.
Okay.
He counts back 1,260 days from September 23, 2015,
Okay.
and lands on April 11th, 2012.
Wow.
You might be wondering why 1,260 days?
Yeah, why that number?
Well, this number appears multiple times in the book of Revelation,
Okay.
often associated with periods of tribulation or the rule of the Antichrist.
Okay, so that's how he connects 2015 to this idea of tribulation.
Yeah.
What makes April 11th, 2012 so significant?
So Mike highlights this major earthquake that occurred near Sumatra on that very day. And this wasn't just any earthquake, though. He cites various news sources like the Christian Science Monitor Live Science that reported on its unusual nature and intensity. Even Sense, a popular YouTube channel that analyzes earthquakes, considered it a highly significant event.
So how does he connect an earthquake to biblical prophecy?
Well, he draws a parallel between this earthquake and a passage in Revelation 12, which describes Satan being cast down to earth.
So he's suggesting this very real earthquake might symbolize something even bigger.
Exactly.
The arrival of Satan on earth.
That's right. It's a dramatic connection to make, and you can see how Mike uses natural events like earthquakes to support his interpretation of prophetic events.
It's interesting how he brings these two seemingly unrelated things together.
Yeah.
An earthquake and the arrival of Satan.
It is, and he goes on to point out that Revelation 12 also talks about a woman who represents the church.
Okay.
Fleeing into the wilderness for, you guessed it, 1,260 days.
There it is again.
This passage is often interpreted as the church being protected during the first half of the tribulation period.
Okay.
Mike contrasts the relative peace and lack of persecution experienced by Western churches, especially compared to the turmoil in the Middle East during that time frame.
So because Western churches haven't experienced any major persecution, he believes we could already be in that first half of the tribulation period.
That's right. He even references a video from the Fuel Project that debunks the pre-tribulation rapture theory.
Right.
The idea that believers will be taken up to heaven before the tribulation begins.
Right.
But he acknowledges that the lack of major persecution for Western churches has been quite unusual, which fits with the idea of them being protected during this time.
Okay, so we have the 1,260 days, the earthquake, Satan being cast down, and the church finding refuge.
Yeah.
And all this leads up to September 23, 2015.
Right.
But what exactly happened on that day that made Mike think it was the abomination of desolation?
So he highlights the Pope's visit to Washington, D.C. on that date,
Because
specifically his Mass at the Basilica of the National Shrine of the Immaculate Conception.
the Pope's visit, how does that fit into all of this?
Well, Mike questions if this event could be the abomination of desolation due to its timing,
Okay.
coinciding with the end of his 1,260-day countdown.
Right.
He also finds significance in the location of the Mass,
Okay.
a church dedicated to the Immaculate Conception, which he sees as a representation of Christ's birth. It seems he's seeking a symbolic meaning in this event, interpreting it through his understanding of biblical prophecy.
So he's suggesting that the Pope, in a place dedicated to the Immaculate Conception,
Yes.
somehow signifies this abomination. That's quite a bold claim.
It is, and it really highlights how Mike seeks to connect contemporary events to his understanding of biblical prophecy,
Right.
even events that might seem completely unrelated at first glance.
Uh-huh.
He even mentions another commentator, Renee M., who suggested that Obama's visit to the proposed birthplace of Christ could also be considered an abomination of desolation,
Wow.
further demonstrating his approach of finding symbolic significance in current events.
So we've got a 1260-day countdown, a major earthquake biblical passages about Satan and the church.
Right.
And then the Pope's visit to Washington, D.C. It's definitely a lot to unpack.
It certainly is. Mike is weaving together a complex tapestry of ideas here.
Yeah. Where do you think he's going with all of this?
I'm not sure, but I'm definitely intrigued.
Me too. And I'm sure you are too. Let's dive further into his reasoning in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, Mike's interpretation definitely raises some eyebrows, wouldn't you say?
It does. I mean, connecting the Pope's visit to this idea of the abomination of desolation
Right.
seems like a stretch to some, don't you think?
Yeah, you're right. It might seem that way. It highlights how Mike seeks symbolic meaning in contemporary events, interpreting them through the lens of his specific understanding of biblical prophecy. However, it's important to remember that biblical prophecy is often open to multiple interpretations.
So there's no single right answer when it comes to deciphering these prophecies.
Not necessarily. While the text itself remains the same, its meaning can shift dramatically depending on the reader's interpretation. For some, the Pope's visit was purely ceremonial, but Mike sees it through an entirely different lens.
Right.
It all comes down to the interpretive framework you bring to the table.
So how should we approach Mike's claims? Should we take them literally, or is there a more nuanced way to understand what he's saying?
I think the key here is to recognize that Mike's interpretation is highly speculative.
Okay.
He's drawing connections between events and biblical passages that are open to a range of interpretations. It's important to remember that correlation doesn't always equal causation.
Right.
Just because two events occur close together doesn't mean one caused the other.
So we shouldn't jump to conclusions or assume that his interpretation is the only valid one.
Exactly. It's crucial to approach these kinds of claims with a healthy dose of skepticism and critical thinking. We should be asking ourselves what evidence supports these claims, if there are other possible explanations, and if there are any potential biases influencing the person making these claims.
That makes sense. I guess it's easy to get caught up in a compelling narrative. But we should always be questioning and considering different perspectives.
Absolutely. It's like putting together a puzzle. You might try to force certain pieces together,
Yeah.
but sometimes they just don't fit. It's important to step back and look at the bigger picture.
Even if we don't take Mike's interpretation literally, I still find it intriguing how he connects these seemingly unrelated events.
I agree. What I find most interesting is how he uses current events to engage with his faith and understanding of the Bible. It shows how people can find meaning and relevance in ancient texts, even in the modern world. For Mike, the Bible isn't just a historical document, it's a living text that speaks to the present.
It's like he's trying to find patterns and make sense of the world around him through the lens of his beliefs.
Precisely. And that's something many of us do, consciously or unconsciously. We all have our own frameworks for understanding the world shaped by our beliefs, experiences, and cultural backgrounds.
Right.
Those frameworks influence how we perceive and interpret events, even global ones.
So even though Mike's interpretation might seem far-fetched to some, it can teach us something about how people connect their beliefs to their perception of reality.
It certainly does. It reminds us that there are many different ways of interpreting the world around us. What might seem like clear evidence to one person could be easily dismissed by another. It all depends on your perspective and how you connect the dots.
I'm starting to realize that this deep dive isn't just about biblical prophecy.
Right.
It's also about how we interpret information, form our beliefs, and make sense of the world. This is especially relevant in an age where we're constantly bombarded with news and different perspectives.
You've hit the nail on the head, and it raises a crucial question. How do we navigate this complex landscape of information and interpretations? How do we separate fact from fiction bias from objectivity?
That's a question we could probably spend a whole other deep dive exploring.
Yeah.
But for now, it's fascinating to see how Mike approaches this challenge, even if his methods might seem unconventional to some.
I agree. And it's a good reminder that even in a world that often feels divided and chaotic, people are still searching for meaning, connection, and a sense of understanding.
Yeah.
They want to make sense of the complexity around them.
Well said. And it's a good reminder for all of us to stay curious, be open to different perspectives, and approach information with a critical but open mind. Who knows, maybe we'll discover unexpected connections and insights along the way.
Indeed. The journey of discovery is often just as important as the destination.
So as we move into the final part of our deep dive, let's reflect on Mike's theory as a whole.
Hmm.
What are the key takeaways from exploring his ideas about September 23, 2015?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest takeaways for me is just how subjective, like, the interpretation of prophecy can be.
Uh-huh.
We saw how Mike, connected a string of events, well, the earthquake, the Pope's visit,
Right.
to this idea of the abomination of desolation.
But someone else might look at those same events and see something completely different.
Absolutely, you're right. It's like trying to decipher a code without the key.
Right.
We might have some pieces of the puzzle, but without the full context,
Yes.
we're bound to come up with different solutions.
And in the case of biblical prophecy, those missing pieces
Yeah,
might include historical context,
sure.
cultural nuances, and even like the original languages the texts were written in.
Precisely. And even with all those pieces, we're still dealing with human interpretation, which
Right.
by its very nature is subjective
Yeah.
and influenced by personal beliefs and experiences.
Mike's theory also got me thinking about how easily we can connect seemingly unrelated events to fit a narrative,
Yeah,
especially when we're dealing with something as complex and mysterious as biblical prophecy.
right.
It's a good reminder to be critical of the information we consume and not just accept any interpretation at face value.
That's such a valuable point. We should always be questioning, the source of information, examining the evidence presented,
Uh-huh.
and considering any potential biases that might be at play.
Right.
We should be asking ourselves, is this information reliable? Does it make sense? What other perspectives might exist?
Right. Just because someone presents a compelling story or connects a few dots
Yeah.
doesn't mean their interpretation is accurate or complete.
Right.
We need to do our own due diligence and critically evaluate the information we encounter.
And we should also bear in mind that interpretations can change over time
Mm.
as new information emerges,
Go on.
or as our understanding of the world evolves. What might have seemed like a convincing interpretation a few years ago might not hold up under scrutiny today.
This whole deep dive has been fascinating.
It really has.
We've explored biblical prophecy,
Yeah.
the power of interpretation,
Uh-huh.
and even our own biases and how they shape our understanding of the world. It's been quite a journey.
It really has, and it leaves us with a thought-provoking question to ponder. How do you interpret current events in relation to your own understanding of the world and your own belief systems?
Mm.
Do you see patterns or connections that others might miss? What frameworks do you use to make sense of the complex and ever-changing world around us?
Those are some great questions for our listeners to reflect on. And as always, we encourage you to keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep digging deeper into the topics that intrigue you. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.